Welcome, Mushroom Family, to another episode of Mushroom Revival Podcast. This is a podcast dedicated to bridging the gap between you, our lovely, incredible, beautiful listeners, and the wonderful, wacky, mysterious world of mushrooms and fungi. We are unbelievably obsessed with the healing power of mushrooms, and we bring on guests from all over the world, experts that we can walk hand in hand with into the vortex of this mysterious fungal world. And we are super excited about today's episode. If you are listening on an audio streaming platform, we have a video component of this episode, so tune in on YouTube if you want to see a mini podcast documentary style. And as always, thank you for tuning in and shrooming in.
And today we have two very special researchers from Washington State University, Jennifer Han and Nicholas Naeger, who are both working on how fungi can help the bee population. So thank you both for being on here. And if you could just give a quick bio of yourselves and how you got into this niche mycology, our listeners would love it.
Well, my background is fairly firmly in honeybees. I've been working with honeybees for 20 years now. I started out as an undergrad in molecular genetics, and I wanted to use science to do something good for the world. So originally I was thinking maybe I'd cure cancer, work on something like that. But about a year in, it was the end of my freshman year, I began to look around for labs to work in, and I found a job posting for a honeybee lab. And when I went in for what I thought would be an interview, I ended up putting on a bee suit and doing some work that day. It was such a fascinating place. This lab at Ohio State, they were at that time running a breeding program for disease-resistant bees. And then those bees went into a neuroscience study program where they were using honeybees to study the fundamental basis of how we smell. So just sense of smell and how the brain encodes information for smell. It was fascinating work. I fairly quickly jumped fully into bees. I continued with my molecular genetics degree, but I added entomology and then went to grad school for entomology. I did bee neuroscience for a while, some bee genetics, but the honeybee health situation drew me to do more applied work, and Washington State University was a place to do that.
My path is a little bit more convoluted. Whereas Nick has been working with bees for 20 years, my bachelor's degree is in landscape architecture, so I was a kind of an School of Fine and Applied Arts designer. And then I got into plant biology, and my PhD is actually in plant biology. So I did a lot of research in plant breeding and genetics. And that research has kind of translated itself into mycology, which is what I'm doing a lot now, where I'm looking at, with my current research, breeding fungi.
And Nick, you primarily work with how fungi or how bees can benefit from mushroom extracts, so kind of using it as a medicine or a remedy for them. And Jennifer, you're more focused on the mycopesticide side and tackling the Varroa mites and potentially other pests who are contributing to colony collapse, correct?
That is correct. I mean, loosely it's my project versus his project, but not really, because it's a lot of collaboration. So we both do all the projects together. Mm-hmm. One of us might just take lead on one or the other.
We're almost always in the lab at the same time, in the field at the same time, and kind of working on the same projects, where it becomes more the division of labors when it comes to writing. And so when it comes time to publish, she writes more of the Medarisium papers, and I write a little more of the extract papers.
Save the bees. I hear that phrase so often, and a lot of people talking about colony collapse. And from what I read, and it's very surface level, I assume you guys are way more experts on this topic than I am. But there's many different ways that bees are affected. And can you just tell our listeners, why are bees so important for our ecosystems?
The number one way that bees are important for the ecosystem is their pollination of plants. Most plants that you see out in the environment are angiosperms. They are flowering plants, and many of those require insect pollination to carry the pollen from plant to plant, and then the plant can finally produce seeds and fruit and so on. And so a lot of plants really rely on insect pollinators to do this job of carrying pollen around. And without them, we just wouldn't have fruits and seeds from many of the plants that are out there. This would include a lot of the foods that we eat. So, apples, cherries, and so on. A lot of the berries, all these are very dependent on insect pollination. And among the insects, honeybees are the best pollinators. They actually eat some of the pollen for some of their nutrition. They get almost all their nutrition from flowers. And so they are absolutely excellent pollinators. So bees are one of those kind of keystone groups of species that help keep the rest of the ecosystem together. Without bees and other insect pollinators, a lot of plants would die out. Without those plants in the ecosystem, it's hard to imagine very many ecosystems without the angiosperm flowering plants as part of them.
So bumblebees are also very productive pollinators, and we have a friend at UMass who's working on similar research on how mushroom extracts can benefit their immune systems to combat whatever viral diseases they're dealing with. Why is the honeybee your focus? Is that just because people tend to have more honeybee colonies and you can maintain them for over a year? I'm pretty sure the bumblebee only lasts for a year. But yeah, and do you foresee the research you're doing also applicable to other species of bees?
Yeah, I can field this one. Honeybees are special and unique in a few ways. Bumblebees do really well in small settings like a greenhouse. By the time you get to huge orchards, it's very hard to get the number of bees that you need to pollinate all of these crops at the same time. So when we take bees to the almond orchards in California, we're literally talking about square miles of almonds blooming all at once. A bumblebee colony may have 50, maybe 400 members in the colony. A honeybee colony will have 20,000, maybe as high as 40 or 50,000. So the number of bees that you can get using honeybees as opposed to bumblebees is much higher. Honeybees also have the advantage that the colony just keeps going year after year. And if you take a colony out of the winter in Canada, you take it down to Southern California where it's warm, it will immediately kind of kick into gear and start foraging. If food's available, they will take, the opportunity. They're not really locked into the season the way a lot of other bee species are.
And that's another thing about bumblebees is they don't start off in January, February as a full-grown colony, right? Whereas these honeybee hives that we bring down, they're full colonies that are ready for pollination in February when the almonds need it in California.
Yeah,
and we're talking about like millions of bees.
Most wild bumblebee colonies in February are going to have one individual, a mated queen, and that's it. And that's just not enough to do major pollination, especially early in the season. So honeybees have several of these unique properties. We can also put them on a truck. They won't be able to eat or forage for a couple days, put them down in somewhere they've never seen before, and they do their thing. It's a fairly remarkable bit of behavioral plasticity, as we call it, that they can just adapt to whatever environment they're in and start pollinating, gathering food, making baby bees, and they do their thing in these multitude of environments, and they're just very responsive to what environment they're in at the time. And so, honeybees are really good in a lot of ways. For small operations, however, I will say bumblebees, orchard bees, leafcutter bees, there's many other options to do pollination if you have a small farm, especially if you have multiple crops and so on. Then, these other bees are definitely an option. But if you have hundreds of acres of monoculture orchard, honeybees are probably the way you're going to need to go to get the numbers that you need to do all of that pollination.
And I'm sure sometimes they're a little bit finicky, especially if they're on a flatbed of a truck for multiple days and they're all, similar genetics across the country. And, from all these different experiments, I'm sure 1.5 million things go wrong. I mean, just from our farming of cordyceps, there's just the smallest little mistakes that we made, and it's like months of work gone. And it's just like piles of mold. We're now mold farmers, and I'm sure it's the same maybe with beekeeping and what I've heard, I've never actually kept my own bees, but I had really great friends. One of my friends was a great beekeeper in Massachusetts, and he was doing this project. Actually, another friend from Massachusetts doing a project with mushroom extracts and bees, and he was doing it on honeybees. I don't know, 4 years ago, and he was doing this project for I don't know how many months, and it was in a community garden, so other people had access to the hive, and one of the girls in the community garden, their dad came to visit for a weekend, and I guess he was a hobby beekeeper, and he opened the hives and I guess sprayed it with some chemicals or something. He thought he would be benefiting, and he killed them all. And my friend Ori, he was like days away from finishing and collecting all of his data, and he's like, this is months of research. And so I'm curious to hear some of those kind of horror stories from you guys on. I know, Jennifer, you said it was a convoluted path to get to this point, and before we jumped on, you were talking about some bees dying and they actually have a smell. I'm just curious, like, what was the hardest parts of this research, and how did you overcome that?
That's a great question. So there are lots of difficulties with beekeeping. I mean, when people ask, how do I save the bees? I never respond, get a hive, because it's just too hard for an unexperienced person to keep a hive alive. It's a lot of work and a lot of money and a lot of time, and they're probably going to die anyway. No, that's a little depressing. But it is difficult, especially for me, because my background wasn't in beekeeping. So my first month here, I was opening up hives and doing research with bees that I've never dealt with before. I'm a plant person. I'm used to things like maybe they can hurt you because they exude an enzyme. So, wash your hands. That was the biggest risk I was used to. Not these guys will sting you and it's going to hurt like hell. So that was a big thing for me to overcome, was just mentally, as someone who's not a born entomologist, to get over the fear of bees a little bit. But once you do, you realize they're actually quite fascinating creatures. So you were talking about earlier, we were mentioning that dead bees do have a smell. And there are other fun things about bees that you'll notice as you just observe them in your experiments. The way they'll groom each other is the most adorable thing. Or when they clean themselves, they'll just put their little antennae through their legs. And yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, I had, having worked with bees for a while, had plenty of beekeeping horror stories, including what was going to be my undergrad senior honors thesis. Got killed in a bee war. So what can happen is in the fall, when there are not very many flowers in bloom, the hives can switch from foraging on flowers to trying to rob honey from each other. And when this happens, all the hives get simultaneously aggressive and defensive. And my little research colonies did not have the number of guards that they needed to fend off these attacks coming from all of the other colonies. And so my research colonies were killed off in this bee war that happened.
And they do the bees know which are the weak colonies. They'll pick on the weak ones.
That is true. Yeah. And once one gets in, then she's likely to keep coming back and really nail that colony and steal food away from it. I also had some of my master's research swarm and fly away. So I had been following individually painted bees for 2 weeks. And then they flew off, and I could see them way up in the treetops for a little bit. And then they really flew off, and never saw them again. Most recently, I'd say kind of my biggest frustration was 2 years ago, we had a massive yellow jacket attack on one of our experiments. And we could pretty much triangulate where the colonies were by the hives that were getting attacked. Because it's like they were going down the row, finishing off and eating to death a colony, and then its neighbor, and then its neighbor. It was really difficult. And once you're into the late season, it's very hard to control yellow jackets unless you find the colony and directly kill it. So yeah, that was very difficult because, it was killing our experiment kind of group by group. And so we had to call the entire experiment off earlier than we wanted to because all of our treatment colonies were getting killed by yellow jackets, and their control colonies were not, because they were slightly different areas.
Is it true? I maybe it was Planet Earth or some nature documentary, but I think it was honeybees, maybe it was bumblebees swarming around a hornet and basically creating enough heat to kill the hornet just with their body heat. Is that true? Do honeybees do that?
Yes, this is very appropriate, because a hornet that they're killing is...
We've got one here.
The Asian giant hornet.
It's a pin we have.
Yeah, it's a pin. So this is a picture of the quote-unquote murder hornets. These have existed in China and Japan for a long time, and bees in China and Japan have had to deal with these for a long time.
And when he's talking about honeybees, he's not talking about the honeybees that you see around here.
So this is one of the important distinctions, is the native bee to that area isn't Apis mellifera, the honeybee that we have. It's this Apis cerana, the Eastern Asian honeybee. And that honeybee has evolved with the Varroa mite, the Asian giant hornet, several of these pests and predators that we are now having to deal with. This Asian honeybee has dealt with it for a long time. And so they have several fantastic defenses against these things. So in the case of the giant hornet, the hornet is armored and the bees cannot sting through it. And the hornet's also particularly insidious in that it's trying to eat the bees and the brood, the baby bees and so on. It's really trying to eat the colony, not just steal some honey. So it's bad news for a beekeeper and for the bees. So what this Asian honeybee has as a defense is it can ball around this invading hornet, and they can shiver their flight muscles. So honeybees thermoregulate their hive during the winter by eating honey, shivering their flight muscles, producing heat, and keeping the hive warm. Well, these Asian honeybees can use this shivering trick, producing heat. They can use it to cook a hornet to death. So they'll ball around the hornet, and all those bees will begin to shake their flight muscles and shiver and produce all of this heat. And the bees can withstand a much higher temperature. Well, I say a much higher, a few degrees anyway, higher temperature than the hornet can. And so there's a way that they can kill the hornet without being able to sting it. They just literally cook it to death. There's another example from the Mediterranean area where those bees evolved a response to a wasp that they couldn't sting to death, where they ball around the abdomen, compress the abdomen of the wasp, and basically suffocate it. So there's another trick that the bees have. Another one that the East Asian honeybee has is when the first hornet arrives, that hornet, after finding a honeybee nest, will mark it with a pheromone, and that calls in all the other hornets. Remarkably, the honeybees will notice that, and they will go out and forage on the foulest smelling things they can find. And I do mean like chicken excrement and so on. Spread that over the entrance of the hive and mask that pheromone signal. They would rather have their hive smelling like crap than have those hornets coming in. So, many remarkable behaviors. Now, the problem is the honeybees we have, they don't have an evolutionary history with these pests, and they do not have these defensive behaviors.
So that's why there's a large concern over the giant hornet being here in Washington and on Canada. It's because our honeybees here aren't equipped to deal with this problem.
Yes, and in those cases, the hornets really can take down a hive, and it's just another problem that we do not need.
No. And all of this is such a testament to the bees' intelligence and importance to the ecosystem, but also its fragility. And I know that the hornets are an issue, the Varroa mites are an issue. What other things are causing colony collapse? I've heard anecdotes about GMO food and GMO crops potentially harming them. What else is happening to these bees aside from the Varroa mites and murder hornet?
I think one of the biggest issues is just habitat loss. A lot of these issues, I think, wouldn't be nearly as bad if the bees were just, in general, healthier. And you can imagine the way we treat our honeybee colonies now, especially these commercial colonies. They're going from a diet of only almond to only apples to only cherries, right? And so that can't be good for just your whole nutrition, right? And so I think having good forage, so a lot of wildflowers, different forage, so diversity, because different plants have different nutrient profiles within their nectar and within their pollen. So not one single plant is a complete diet, if you will. Diversity is what bees really need to stay healthy. And so I think if they had a better habitat and more forage, they would in general be healthier. And if they're healthier, they're better equipped to deal with Varroa, better equipped to deal with viruses. They're better equipped to deal with pesticides and all the other issues that come about. You have other thoughts, Nick?
No, it's very much true. These commercial colonies have a lot of nutritional stress. But when we look kind of at the big picture of pollinators across the U.S., it seems like all of them are in decline. Even birds and bats are having issues. And so birds and bats can handle pesticides quite well. It seems more general habitat loss is, driving a lot of the big picture. And then, yes, all the nutritional stress that comes with that. We have situations where we live in Washington is a heavily agricultural area. It's almost edge to edge fields. There's not a lot of wild habitat. And then we have issues where invasive weeds come in. And so they will spray they'll use broad spectrum herbicides in the few remaining ditch flowers that we have. And so, there's very little wild habitat out there. And this is particularly an issue where here in Eastern Washington, it's very dry also. The bees really have to make their keep. If we don't move them around, they have to make their keep basically from April to July. So they just have those few months to really build up, make all their honey, and then hunker down for a very dry August, September, October. There's no food in November. They go into winter, and they have to last until March and early April. So very stressful when there's a lack of wild flowers and natural habitat around, just a lack of diversity. And yeah, it's hard to find a flower in the fall around here in a very unfortunate way.
Right. And so again, when people say, what can I do to help the bees? The biggest thing is plant more flowers and just make sure the flowers you do plant are pollinator friendly, because a lot of landscape cultivars have been bred for petals or whatnot, and they might not actually still produce the right kind of nectar or pollen anymore. So make sure the plants that you do plant are good for pollinators.
Yes, and in that way, if you do plant pollinator habitat, then you're helping all of the pollinators.
Right, not just bees,
right.
Not just honeybees, but there are native bees and a lot of other native pollinators
right.
that you can help.
All the butterflies and so on, they all get helped out.
Do you have a good source for wildflowers? Is there a specific for the region? I'm sure there's different wildflowers depending on where you live. And this might, be for the U.S. I know we have listeners from all over the world, but I don't know if you know a global supplier as well, or just a local shop.
For a long time, we were planting. There are several groups that made bee flower mixes.
Like I think Burpee does a lot of pollinator mixes. But what you were saying before is very important. Make sure it's good for where your region is. Because some plants that are fine for some regions are considered invasive, noxious weeds in others. So just getting a general pollinator mix may not be appropriate.
Yeah, the seed packet mixes are not hard to find online. Yeah. One of the things we did in our yard this year was a lot of zinnias, lots of different colors and shapes. And it seems like butterflies and bees, like all the pollinators, enjoy it.
Yeah. And they're pretty.
And they bloom from June to the first frost, which is quite nice.
Hey, guys.
If you love the show and want to continue getting tantalizing mushroom content such as this, please consider supporting us by going to mushroomrevival.com and purchasing one of our amazing mushroom products.
This is how we keep the lights on. This is a total passion project. We do not offer any outside advertisers, and this has totally revolutionized our health. We want to spread the mushrooms far and wide in every corner possible. If you're listening to this, we will offer you a special coupon code that we're not offering anybody else. If you're listening to this, this is a little Easter egg that you just found. The coupon code is called
PODTREAT, PODTREAT, all caps, no
and
spaces.
to figure out how much you actually save, you got to figure it out. You got to open that Easter egg as well and put it into your cart to find out a special offering that only you will get. We love these products. They help revolutionize our health, and we want to share that health and abundance with you guys who equally love mushrooms as much as we do. So when you go watch a movie, you get a bowl of popcorn, obviously. So when you listen to mushroom podcasts, you get a mushroom tincture pumping through your veins, pumping through your eardrums. You are a mushroom. Help the mushroom revival. We love you guys so much. Back to the show. You were talking about habitat, and it got me thinking. The first time I met my friend Ori, who is the beekeeper in Massachusetts, he started raving about, why do we put bees in a square box when in the wild they're an oval? And he was just going off on, traditional beekeeping. They mimicked the oval shaped, and I believe it was Egypt, and I think maybe a few other countries as well. But he was like, yeah, why don't we do that? It's nuts, and it's probably stressing the bees out, which is further, causing colony collapse. And kind of what we were talking about is really fixing the environment. And that's kind of the closest thing to home. And home is where we kick our shoes off and de-stress. And if you're stressed out in your home, where can you catch a break? Have you played with that before? Are there any good hive makers that make ovals? Does it actually not work at all?
Well, I think it has a lot more to do with the ease and the regularity with the frames that we have. You can talk about
it. The modern beehive was invented over 150 years ago and has not changed much. And you do find that bees tend to use the corners of the hive last. You'll find empty comb in the corners because the cluster that they make to stay warm is round, or at least football shaped. And so, they tend to, it's kind of a waste of space for them. And it's probably a bit of a loss in terms of heating the extra space. But on the other side, it's very easy to move frames around and trade frames and do things like that.
Right, because everything's standard and the same. And if you're taking a lot of care of your bees, you're going to want to move things around and check on them fairly often.
Yeah, another interesting thing, Tom Seeley, researcher at Cornell, he did some interesting experiments where he used swarms of bees, and he would present them with different hive boxes and basically say, hey, bees, what sorts of homes do you prefer? And basically let the bees tell them what they liked. And he did some experiments with these different shapes of the hive. And it didn't seem to matter so much. The overall volume was more important than that. And then they also liked higher off the ground, smaller entrances to defend, some things like that. But if I remember right, kind of a more cubic hive versus a longer rectangle did not matter much to them. Bees are fairly adaptable. I think they do decently well in the square boxes. One thing that I will bring up, since we talked about habitat loss, one of the primary hive components is foraged tree sap. So honeybees forage on tree sap, and they turn into a substance called propolis, which becomes like somewhere between chewing gum and a hard glue. And they will use this to seal up cracks in the hive, waterproof it, glue bits together. And it's another important thing that the bees forage on. And when they, another important aspect is this propolis, then, having the tree sap, has all sorts of antimicrobial compounds that are in it. So bees that forage on higher propolis are somewhat resistant to some of the fungal diseases and other microbial diseases that the bees can get. So another important aspect of habitat is not just the flowers, but having some other wild areas where the bees could forage on poplar or pine resins or so on to take back to the hive.
So in addition to habitat issues, there's the pests. And I know you guys were targeting Varroa mites in particular. And is this problem unique to human-kept bee colonies, or do you see this in any bee colony in North America?
Varroa mites are an issue for honeybees in general. I think if you find any feral swarms, they're going to have Varroa. So it's not just a human issue.
Yeah, some of the estimates done mainly on the east coast of the U.S. Estimated that 90% of the wild hives were killed by Varroa. And so, the wild population absolutely plummeted when the mite came to the U.S. It came in 1986 or so.
Mid to late 80s is when they arrived in the U.S.
Mm-hmm. By the mid 90s, they were far spread pretty much everywhere.
However, they weren't causing the same sort of devastation
yes, this
back
is an
then that
interesting
they are
point.
now.
They were not as deadly back then. When I first started beekeeping in 2000, 2001, we could find a colony with these really high mite levels, and we could treat them with a chemical miticide. The miticides worked back then. You could get the mite levels down, and the bees would survive. And they could survive the winter and at least limp along to the spring and be okay. Now, a much lower number of mites will not only crash the colony population, but then what happens is when you treat for mites, the bees don't seem to bounce back in the same way that they used to. A big chunk of that is viruses that the mites are spreading around. So even when we treat for the mites, the viruses linger in the hive for a period of time, and it's hard to get a nice, healthy set of bees to survive through the winter. So, before we could find a problem colony in September, still get it to survive the winter. Now you almost have to get your problems fixed by, July or August, so the hive can raise a healthy set of bees in September to then get through the winter. Because, those bees that are born when the mite levels are high, their lifespan is far too short. They die off too quickly.
So, backtrack just a little bit for people who don't know. Bees raise different kinds of bees throughout different parts of the year. So in the fall, they raise what we call, quote, winter bees. And so these ones survive a lot longer than the ones that are born in, say, April or March. And so, if they have viruses, these ones that are supposed to last all winter just don't. Or they come out really weak and not in good shape.
One thing that kind of fits into all this is you can begin to see how all of the different problems facing bees compound each other. Because a pesticide, the bees might survive it, but it shortens their lifespan. The mites will shorten their lifespan. Then the viruses will shorten their lifespan. All these things work together to where each worker that the hive creates doesn't live long enough to pay back that investment to the colony. And so rather than the colony slowly growing over time, it just crashes. And the population goes down, not enough young bees are being raised. The individuals living a short time then compounds to the hive living a short time. And it's really difficult then to disentangle all of these little stressors that the bees are dealing with right now. It's hard to find a pesticide-free environment. It's pretty much impossible to find a mite-free environment. And now we are finding viruses in almost every single hive that we test. So, these problems are everywhere and they're feeding on each other. And that was part of the whole colony collapse disorder phenomenon. There was no single smoking gun to point to and say, that's a problem. Instead, it was all of these things kind of building up together until we hit a tipping point.
So this is where mushrooms and you two come in to save the day on totally, different strategies, but they all are interconnected, and I think they work together beautifully well. Like you said it perfectly. This one knocks it down a little bit, this one knocks it down a little bit, and when you put them all together, we have a collapse. And so how can mushrooms save the day? We're going to start with Medarisium, which is an entomopathogenic fungi, or a fungi that attacks arthropods or insects, and particularly the Varroa mites. So are you using the MET52 strain from Novozymes, which was just patented by Monsanto, now Bayer?
Right. It's been bought many a times by several companies. Yeah.
within telling us how you're using Medarisium, kind of help us visualize how these mites are getting into these hives and what exactly they're doing. So it seems like they're spreading viruses, but how? Are they sharing the honey and then there's some sort of contamination? Are they biting the bees? Like, how are the mites actually harming these colonies?
Kind of gruesome in a way. These are ectoparasitic parasites, so they'll latch onto the honeybee, and using their mouth parts, they'll more or less excavate a hole into their exoskeleton, and then they'll kind of dig up the soft tissue and eat it. And so while they're digging that up, their mouth parts are kind of dirty, and with that, that's where the exchange and the transmission of viruses can go between the Varroa and the honeybee, is when they're feeding.
Yeah, fairly similar to mosquitoes and malaria. The mite just kind of spreads it around, a bit of a dirty needle phenomenon. And the mites are very sloppy feeders compared to a mosquito. And they really do a significant amount of damage to the bees.
And I've heard the size compared as imagine if you had like a dinner plate on your back. That would be like a Varroa mite on the bee, roughly in size. So something like that, just living on you 24/7, just eating your good stuff.
Right, like being parasitized by a rabbit. I mean,
Yeah.
It's a significantly sized parasite, and it does do significant damage. The real problem is that this mite reproduces in the pupal honeybee, on the pupae.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it does so. The pupal casing in the honeycomb is all sealed up and protected from the other bees. And that's where the mite reproduces. And the little pupa has no defense against it. And so these mites just, suck away at the hemolymph and then mainly the soft tissue fat that surrounds the exoskeleton on the inside of it.
And that's a big deal because that soft tissue, the fatty tissue there, is responsible for a lot of things, including some of their immunity. Yes. And so when it's feeding on that, it's lowering the honeybee's defenses and its immunity to other pathogens and other pesticides and all sorts of things. So again, it just knocks everything out.
Yeah, analogously, they're not just getting physical fat, but they're scraping away the organ that is the honeybee's liver. It does all the detoxification and some of the immune work also. And so, this mite is really quite an ugly, parasite. And, 20 years ago, it was kind of rare to find it being so bad that it would kill pupae. The bee would still emerge as an adult. Now we find dead pupae, and it's clear the mite's getting worse in some ways. And it's very sad when we have these in the lab to watch a poor little bee larvae pupae with a mite on it squirm as it's getting bitten.
Because there's nothing it can do.
Nothing they can do.
And I guess I should backtrack too and just say that the Varroa mite, if people don't know, is not a native parasite of the honeybee that we know. This is a native parasite of the eastern honeybee, the Apis cerana that Nick was talking about earlier, that has defenses against the giant Asian hornet. And so I think that has a lot to do why it's particularly bad for Apis mellifera, the honeybees that we have here. Is they haven't co-evolved together.
The Asian honeybee has some fun defenses against Varroa. What it can do is if it detects a mite in a pupae, it will actually entomb that pupa so it will never come out. And the mite and the bee dies, but the hive completely encases it so that mite can never come back out. Our honeybee doesn't have that.
How can Medarisium help?
Okay, so we are using Medarisium as an alternative acaricide to deal with the Varroa mite. So currently there's a lot of different synthetic chemical acaricides out there. And some of them some work, some of them, there's lots of reports of losing their efficacy. So I think there is a real need to find something that can work against these Varroa, especially something that may be more of a long-term solution. Because again, with these Varroa, they reproduce so quickly that resistance, it's a pessimistic thing to say, but seems almost inevitable with some of these chemicals out there. It just is a matter of time.
Yes, in just my time beekeeping, we've gone through a chemical called Apistan that worked, and then it didn't. And then there's no organophosphate pesticide, Kumafos, that worked for a while, and then it didn't. And recently, the industry's been propped up a lot by amitraz, and now that chemical, the mites appear to be evolving resistance to it also. And so, yes, we would love to have some non-chemical alternative that worked. And another thing we should point out is these miticides that we put into the hive. It's a net positive for the bees because the mites are absolutely deadly if you let the infection go. But these miticides are not entirely harmless to the bees. Some people have pointed out that it can cause sperm deficiencies and perhaps some reproductive deficiencies in the queen also. So again, we might not see the immediate effect, in terms of like dead bees. So this miticide seems fairly safe, but then the queen needs to be replaced earlier because she can't lay fertile eggs anymore. So these miticides, we'd like to move past chemical miticides into something a little safer for the bees and something where the mites have harder time evolving resistance to it.
Right. So that's one of the advantages of just biological controls in general, is that there's often a lower case of resistance, or at least a delayed time development of resistance between the pest and what you're using. And so that's why we're looking at Medarisium. And we started with Medarisium, I think, because there were some initial trials done by the USDA in Michigan, I believe.
Utah and Florida.
Yeah, where they were looking at Medarisium. And the initial studies seemed promising. They found some efficacy. And so we decided we'd try to take that a step further, because one of their biggest issues was that the fungus wasn't surviving long in the hive. Because if you guys don't know what Medarisium is, it's a soil-dwelling fungus, right? And so you can imagine what the temperatures in the soil would be compared to a beehive, where the bees thermoregulate and they like it around 32, 35 C.
Yeah, nearly your body temperature. They keep the hive nice and warm.
Right. And so that was one of the biggest obstacles, I think, that a lot of these other labs had. And so I think that's maybe why that research was kind of piddled off for a little while. But we decided to pick that back up with, I think, some encouragement from Paul Stamets. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to tell us about the life cycle of Medarisium and how it kills?
Sure. So I'm assuming your followers know a lot about mushrooms, or at least know something about fungi, since they're listening to this and have an interest in it. So this is not your typical, what you think of as cordyceps mushrooms, where it grows a fruiting body out the head of the ant or whatnot. This is more of what would look like, if you would, a mold, if you will. So what happens is the spore lands on the exoskeleton of the Varroa mite. It grows a little infection peg and burrows through the exoskeleton, and then it proliferates inside the Varroa. This strain of Medarisium, this species produces compound called destructions. Based on its name, you can imagine it's quite deadly. So these destructions, right, very aptly named.
Love it.
These destructions will kill the insect. And so once it's dead, the fungi will begin its asexual reproduction and bust through the exoskeleton and make all these conidia, their asexual spores.
Yeah. That being said, we do not get a lot of multi-generational Medarisium when we treat a colony. It looks like that when we bring the mites into the lab, we grow fungus back out of them, but they do not produce much spores on the dead mites in the hive. At first, I thought this was kind of disappointing because I thought it'd be nice to get a little ecosystem of biocontrol going in the hive. But I think it's actually an advantage because that means we can control the strain a little bit better. We do not want it going, unbridled evolution as a pathogen in the hive. And so it'd be kind of nice if the effects are fairly short term, and that way we can continue to make sure with selection in the lab that it will only infect and kill mites, and that is very safe for bees, and it won't evolve into something different out in the hive.
When he mentions that, that's another thing I should mention, is one of the reasons that we looked at this fungus is it's a natural, it's a native fungus. So it's a native soil fungus throughout all of the U.S. It's found throughout most of the world, which is a big deal because I know a lot of issues when people look at biological control agents is oftentimes it's introducing something new to the ecosystem to deal with a new problem. You don't want to add something exotic to deal with something exotic, right? Because then you have to, bring in the snake to kill the rat, to kill the, so this is really nice. It's already there. And so we're not adding anything new to the environment that isn't already existing.
Yeah. The only thing we're really doing is pushing the fungus to be a more effective killer of mites and making sure that we get no hint of honeybee infection.
I mean, I went to our community gardens here where we live in Pullman, and I dug up a shovel full of soil and took it back to the lab, and I was able to isolate this fungus from just the community garden a few blocks down the street. So again, it's really nice because it's there, and it makes me less nervous about, again, releasing some sort of strain that could possibly go out of control.
Yeah, Medarisium is very productive and probably the go-to mycopesticide, at least that's actual fungus based. And it's not currently affecting honeybees, which is great. And I imagine you guys will work hard to keep it that way. But why not? Because Medarisium will infect dozens and dozens of different insects. So what about the honeybees is saving themselves from this infection?
I don't know if there's a definitive answer. I have a lot of hypotheses as to why. I will say within all of our experiments and all of our trials, we haven't seen an increased mortality in honeybees with the treatments. So like you said, clearly they don't seem to be affected by this. And I think some of it might have to do with the mode of action with which these spores infect and kill insects, right? It has to get onto the exoskeleton. There it receives chemical cues with the cuticle of the exoskeleton to let it know it's the appropriate host, and then it germinates and all of that. But honeybees are incredibly fuzzy, and this could work to their advantage. I think some of their hairs is just physically keeping the spores off of their exoskeleton. And if they don't make that contact, they won't ever germinate. And so I think that might have something to do with that. And these hairs are also like negatively charged because that helps trap pollen. So they're charged. So I think that might also just be helping trap these fungal spores, again, keeping that from the bees to keep them safe.
Yeah. Bees are also excellent groomers. They groom their body very well. And there is a stage with this fungus where when it's initially germinating, it has to kind of drill through the exoskeleton of the host. During that stage, it's a little fragile. And if a honeybee simply grooms over it, it will break off that little germination tube and, it can't get in. Now, that being said, we've also tested it on larvae, which do not have hair, do not have much behavior, and they seem naturally resistant. So it seems that there is some internal immune factor that the bees are really good at fighting off this infection if it does get to them. They just seem naturally immune. And so, it's been something it's made our work easier. Yeah.
No shave, no November for the bees.
No, absolutely. Yeah.
On a side note, Nick in previous research has made tiny razors for bees to shave off their hairs.
No way.
That is true. I study gravity perception in honeybees, and there are these papers pointing to these mechanosensory hairs on their neck as being particularly important for gravity perception. And so to test this hypothesis, I shaved them off. So I broke apart a safety razor, cut that blade into microscopic little scalpels, and I shaved anesthetized bees with these little mini scalpels until they had no hair around their neck, and actually showed that they could still perceive gravity just fine.
Huh. It's like whiskers for a cat. Don't whiskers do the same thing?
I heard that they help them perceive width, maybe?
Yeah, know the size of holes they can fit into and so on. Yeah. With bees, they have a bit of a problem with the exoskeleton. Their skin doesn't stretch. They have some problems perceiving their own body's position relative to itself. And so they actually have mechanosensory hairs in their joints to help them perceive their own body.
So how do you apply this? Say, this was a commercial product and, some beekeepers wanted to use it in their hives. is this a spore spray? Is this just spores or an oil? Or do you just spray it everywhere? Is it specific spots? How does it work?
It's a fantastic question. So that's actually kind of where we're at right now in our research, is trying to figure out what's the most appropriate delivery method for these spores. So during our initial research and trials, I did the easiest method possible, which is I grew it on a petri dish, and I flipped the petri dish over. I pulled out the agar plate and just put it in the hive upside down so that the spores were kind of raining down on the bees, if you will. I think while that works for research purposes, if this were to be a more applicable thing, especially for commercial beekeepers where they have thousands of hives, we're thinking maybe something a little bit more easy of an application. So we're currently looking at growing it on grains and possibly using them as grain bags, or maybe inserting it into like a existing frame. We're also looking at different synthetic materials like felt and impregnating that with the fungus. There's a couple of routes that we're looking at.
So one of my favorite ones, for those that have the video component, I'll hold it up to the camera. This is a little bag made from banana fibers, and the bees can chew it up over time. And so if we grow the fungus on a grain, we can put this mesh bag of grain into the hive. Spores can fall out of the mesh, but then as the bees chew it away, because they don't like this foreign thing in their hive, they chew the bag, they begin to spill the grain all over the place. Bees crawl into the bag and pull the grain out. They end up spreading the spores around as they work it. And if you come back 3 or 4 weeks later, all you find is a few fibers, but most of the bag has been chewed away and cleaned out.
And it's really nice because, again, it's made with banana fiber, so it's a nice natural fiber. We're not concerned about putting something, too weird in a hive.
Hopefully they don't eat any of the spores.
Well, we have a project going right now with bees and the Medarisium fungus in cages. The cage trials are completed, and we're analyzing the results. Our preliminary results so far suggest that the bees that are exposed to this fungus, they're about the same or maybe slightly better off in their immune system. So something kind of interesting, if this spore is non-infectious to the bees, if they can fight it off easily, then it could be nutritional for them, or it could even act like a vaccine to help boost their immune system against microbial pathogens.
It might just trigger a response, even though it's not pathogenic, that might just amp up their immune system.
We actually have Medarisium in 2 grain jars right now, and nothing to do with bees, but for cockroaches, actually. We had a few running around our house that we saw. We just moved into this house in Austin, Texas in June, and first time really dealing with cockroaches, and sort of like, oh man, we gotta do some mycopesticides up in here. And we just caught a live cockroach like a week ago.
Yeah, then I caught another one 2 days ago.
And we put it in, and it took a while. It was definitely kind of like, wow, I'm trapped. Definitely was freaking out. But then we saw it, I feel like a few days ago, and it was twitching, but it was still alive. But it was like,
yeah, I was having a hard time.
Yeah, now it's almost covered with mycelium, and we actually since then caught another one and put it in there, and it was like, oh, I know what happened to my friend. I am not excited for what's about to happen. And it hasn't.
You can see his face.
Oh my, yeah. I think it like kind of climbed on top of it and was maybe trying to move it or something, but it was like, oh no, I'm in it, in too deep.
So I have some follow-up questions with this mite issue before I jump into the extracts. But number one, if bees are such good groomers, why don't they ever pick off the mites from themselves? I mean, if I'm imagining a rabbit-sized pest, I feel like I could just, get that thing off. And then the second question is, does the Medarisium have any impact on bees that are already bitten? Will that fungus ever kill the mite that's currently biting a bee?
I see the second question. The answer is probably not. I mean, the fungus would have to go through the exoskeleton of the mite, I think. And I don't think there's any way that the spore could be into the bee system in an intact living way that the mite could ingest it later. But if the spores are in the hairs of the honeybee and the mite crawls through them, then it will definitely get infected that way. The first question is a little harder to answer without diagrams, but in short, I was lamenting this the other day, watching a bee trying to groom a mite off and failing miserably.
Her poor little legs. She was trying so hard.
Yeah. So the first thing is that the mites are very flat. So when Jennifer made the analogy like having a dinner plate stuck to your back, they're very flat in that way. Yes.
Yeah.
Their top surface is quite slick, and then their undersurface is spiny. And it's spiny in a way that if the mite is pushed in one direction, the spines dig in, and it can't be moved anymore. It gets pushed in the other direction, the spines dig in that way, and it can't be pushed anymore. And they have very short, stubby legs. So they're
toes.
Yeah, they're not fast movers, but these legs are very spiny and hairy, and they grip on very well. And so you will see a bee try to groom these off, and just having troubles doing so. And then the other thing is when the mite feeds, it will kind of burrow between the exoskeleton plates on the abdomen and kind of dig up in there in a way that it just makes it hard to remove. And in fact, if you see a mite dug in and feeding and you try to pull it out with forceps, it is remarkable the grip that they have.
It's near impossible to pull a varroa off of a bee.
Yeah, it's easy to pull apart of the bee as you do so,
yes.
In fact. They really are dug in there. And
like Nick was saying,
really
they do burrow and like wedge themselves in between the plates of the honeybee. And so, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Now, that being said, if you have honeybees in an arena, these little stubby legs can move quite quickly to jump from bee to bee. And so they can spread fairly easily. We haven't talked about it much, but one of the things that makes the mites particularly problematic is that high mite levels are linked with the colony having the individuals in the colony having navigational issues. So a bee that's been heavily infected with mites and viruses is more likely to fly to the wrong hive and try to get in there. And so the mites and the viruses are helping to spread all of the other diseases from hive to hive.
So let's jump to that. The Varroa mites are not the only thing, and we touched upon these viruses as another cause of colony collapse. How can we use mushrooms or fungi to boost or support the immune systems of these honeybees?
Yeah, well, currently what we are doing is we have Fungi Perfecti, our collaborator company on the west side of the state. They will grow whatever fungus we request even, and make an extract of the fungal mycelium and send it to us. And then what we do is we mix it into sugar water and feed it to the bees. Sugar water feeding is very common in the beekeeping industry right now. In the area where we live, it would be common anyway because there's no food in the fall. There's just no flowers in bloom. And so beekeepers very commonly give bees these sugar water feeders just so they have some carbohydrates to eat. Bees feed on it readily. They'll process it into a honey-like substance and get some stored food that way. But it's also very clear that sugar water on its own is not enough. It's not good for the bees. It's the same as you drinking corn syrup with nothing else in it. You'll survive, but your health will decline over time.
You're getting only sugars.
Right. And so we can mix fungal extracts into the sugar water. The bees consume it quite easily. And we've shown it has several effects that then are beneficial to the bees. We've shown that with cages, when we have cages of bees and they're fed sugar water or sugar water with the fungal extracts, that the ones getting the fungal extracts live longer. just a couple days longer, even just a fraction of a day longer, but that can help the hive out, and that compounds over time with the thousands of bees, helping it get back up to that threshold where each bee is repaying the investment that was put into her, and she's helping the hive grow rather than shrink. In terms of what is in the extracts that's causing the effect, that is a very interesting question. When we first started out, Fungi perfecti, when they first approached our lab, Paul Stamets had noticed that honeybees were foraging in his mushroom beds. And then not long after, he heard that, bees are having problems with viruses. Well, several of the mushrooms that they grow have these antiviral properties, especially in vitro assays in the lab and so on. It's fairly clear that they can have antiviral effects. So that's what kind of started the collaboration. We gave bees these extracts in sugar syrup in cages and found that it helped them reduce viruses. However, we now have a lot more research into it, kind of showing that it's not, probably not, at least entirely, an antiviral drug. There seems to be something else going on. The bees seem better off in many different respects, independent of their viral load. We have seen these extracts help bees fight gut parasites and things that are not affected by antiviral compounds. So it looks like these extracts are making the bees healthier in some way. Their immune system seems better to fight off these viruses and other pathogens that they might get. What exactly is in it? Well, there's where we have to speculate a little bit. In the past couple of years, we've actually done a fair amount of nutritional testing and a little bit of chemistry to try to figure out what exactly is in these extracts. One of the things we found early on was that the mineral profile that is in these fungal extracts ends up being very similar to what they get in nectar and honey. The ratios of potassium and sodium, phosphorus, magnesium, and so on, these are all very well balanced and similar to the bee's natural diet.
Again, things that are completely absent in the sugar syrup feed that people give bees now.
Right. So we know that bees are getting some minerals, they're getting their calcium and some things like that. Another thing that we have found, and here we stand on the shoulders of previous labs, May Berenbaum's lab in Illinois has shown that when bees consume these polyphenol compounds that are naturally found in nectar and honey, that these boost the immune system of the bee. They will make it more resistant to pesticides. And then there's some good evidence that these sorts of changes to the immune system help against pathogens also. And basically, when fungi ferment wood, we're particularly talking about the lignin component of wood, they end up producing very similar polyphenolic compounds to what you find naturally in nectars, honeys, and pollens. And so these fungal extracts that I have, they tend to be this brownish color. They're very similar to honey in terms of color, and a lot of this seems to come from these phenolic compounds. So we know that the bees are getting some phenolic compounds that can help their immune system. We know that they're getting minerals. We found some B vitamins, meaning, like vitamin B2, vitamin B5, not BEE vitamins. There's several things in the extracts that are probably providing both nutritional and then also some sort of an immune boost. The FDA is very interested to know, is this a food or is it a drug? Because there is no nutritional supplement category for livestock, animals, including bees. And we're kind of coming down that it's closer to a food. When you eat broccoli and fruit and so on, you get all these antioxidants, green tea, red wine, all these antioxidants. These are good for your system, but they're not really drugs. It's a little closer to food than it is to drug. And I think that's what we're seeing with these extracts, where there's a nutritional component, this kind of immune boosting component. These are getting some antioxidants and so on. And it's closer to that than some sort of a pharmaceutical to help them control viruses.
Because we've seen very little evidence that it is a direct antiviral.
Yeah, we had a collaborator in Montana, Michelle Flanagan. Her lab has a petri dish assay with bees' cells.
Yeah, she has a cell line culture.
It's a cell culture, and she can infect these cell lines with viruses. And when we did this collaboration, she could not find viral reductions in the system where the bee immune system is not in place. And you have individual cells, but a lot of the immune system is mediated in the hemolymph of the bee. It's blood, basically. And so when you remove the immune component and you just have cells in a dish, they did not get the antiviral effect. And so it does appear that the bee immune system is the key player in this, and we're feeding into it in some way.
I'm curious, how many species have you tried, or is there a handful based on, you said, the shoulders of other labs' research? And have you tried, pure mycelium versus fruiting bodies versus, adding other herbs in there? There must be, when you're talking about kind of the mineral content, I first thought of like spirulina. Yeah, I feel like that's super nutrient dense, or any of like nettles is super nutrient dense, or other kind of plants and or mushrooms. I know a lot of the fruiting bodies have a lot more nutrients than the mycelium, but maybe not polyphenols or other compounds that you're looking for. So what have you tried? What has worked better than others? And are you dying to try a million other things?
Yeah, we've concentrated mainly on polypore fungi for a few different reasons. A lot of them grow well in the lab. They digest wood well, and many of them have just very interesting chemistry. I'd say by this point we've tested at least 10 different polypores. We've tested chaga mushroom mycelium and a few other relatives, or ones that have similar lifestyles anyway.
And really the ones that we've been testing are ones that there's some literature, some research out there showing that they have some sort of antiviral or immunity properties. So that's kind of where we focused our research on.
Yeah, we find that many of them have some effect, but there's others that stand out. And the Ganoderma group of mushrooms, the reishi mushrooms, that group I'd say is kind of the star so far. The Amadou group, foamies, they've done okay. But there are other ones like the red-belted polypore. That one did not look good. And I'm not unconvinced that there might even be some mild toxic effects with that one.
And like Tramides, we looked at turkey tail.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of them just seem to help a little bit, but the Ganoderma and the foamies and some others seem to do better. And then, occasionally we would get one that just didn't look great, and then we just move on after a small cage trial.
What is fascinating, though, is not only are there differences between species of polypores that we've looked at, but it also, you can get various results depending on what substrate you grow the fungi on. So there's so many variables out there.
Yeah, in fact, that is one of our current things, is to figure out what the best growth substrate is. And Fungi Perfecti has been great working with us in that regard. We had found that birch wood was working quite well. And then the supply chain problems associated with getting birch wood just, I think it's kind of taken out of the running. We were sold linden wood as birch wood, and we just had these endless problems trying to get a consistent supply chain.
So if you want to talk about a point where thought you would quit when it was just like a terrible disaster, this was one of them. We had figured out birchwood was the best substrate. Our collaborators found a supplier, got all this, quote, birchwood, grew all of it up, did all the extractions. We ran all of our experiments, found really weird results that weren't consistent with our preliminary ones. Yeah. Went back, tried to figure it out. Then we got the wood DNA tested to figure out, what is this? It wasn't birch. It wasn't even close.
Yeah, we were doing the DNA test because we know that the wood can be pre-infected with fungi. You know, a lot of trees have latent
endogenous fungi just living in them.
Right, especially all that dead wood on the inside. There's a lot of fungi living in there. So we were doing a DNA test to try to find if there was a parasitic contaminant that was toxic. And instead we found that the entire wood wasn't what we thought it was.
It was Tilia, linden, or basswood.
And so, that was difficult because it meant that we we found that out, I think it was September or October.
Yeah.
And basically that entire years of field work
Was done using like things grown on the wrong thing.
and and it basically didn't work. And so we got very mild effects and couldn't figure out why things would be so inconsistent. And that was it in the end. The type of wood was different in a way that mattered to the fungus, and it mattered to the final product for the bees.
Yeah.
So now we're looking at things like rice and oats and
things that you can get a consistent supply of.
Yes, even alder wood. Alder's very weedy in Washington, and we can get a lot of alder, and that's at least somewhat related to birch. So we're testing things out, and hopefully we'll find something that is highly scalable. Well, in fact, I say we're now limiting ourselves to things that are scalable for production. And so hopefully it won't be too long. We'll have a final round of tests to satisfy the FDA. And our recipe's nearly finalized for the grow procedure. So hopefully it won't be too long, and there will be something out there for beekeepers to use and experiment with. And yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your perseverance and the development of this product.
Yeah. I guess kind of the next part of it, you had asked about mixing plants into it. And that is another very interesting avenue of study. We may go there in the future, but for now we're trying to just get the fungal extracts figured out and kind of out the door and so on. But I do have interest in not only adding plants that could provide minerals like comfrey and nettles and so on, but there's some very interesting plants that provide some polyphenols, right? So we could look at spices. Fungi perfecti has some extract sprays that have licorice and some interesting chemicals, from these other plants that end up in these sprays and extracts. So yeah, many, many more places to go. I'm sure we'll get to some of those places in the future, but it's one of the reasons it would be nice to kind of get this out to beekeepers is beekeepers are notorious tinkerers. They will change and experiment and, double the dose, half the dose, do what they want to do. And it will be very interesting to see the different combinations that come out of this. Cinnamon and sugar, different spices. It's really hard to say what could have these effects. Bee nutrition is still fairly understudied. We know they like a diversity, but after that, I'd say we're still in the early stages. It was only 10 years ago when we began to look at, take a real deeper look at it, more than, bees need protein and sugar.
What research are you dying to, besides getting approval by the FDA, getting this out to beekeepers, is there any other research that helps the bees that you're just dying to see done or do yourselves?
Ooh, that's a good question. I have a long list of moderately interesting bee questions that are not necessarily ones that I would do now when honeybee health is such an issue. But there are fun things that I would like to do one day, like use the honeybee dance language to tell us about bees' time perception, and then see if we can mess with that time perception with certain compounds or so on. There's a lot to be done with bee learning and memory. Dealing with honeybee mortality in cages, I'm now very interested in the bee death process. Because in short, she's alive, she's alive, she's alive. She twitches for an hour or two and then is dead. And
it's weird how fast bee death can come on.
Yeah, I mean, we don't find sick bees in the cages. We find healthy bees and then dead ones, basically. And we'll find just one or two of these in the in-between stage where you know that they are dying. And so it'd be fascinating to really get into what is happening when they go from okay to dead within a few hours. What is that acute cause of death? That's still an open question that I'd love to know.
So I have high hopes for the mushroom extracts improving bee immune systems. But what is your take on this? Do you see this being potentially pivotal for beekeeping and then, agriculture as a whole? And then what are your thoughts on the Medarisium and any mycopesticides? Do you see this picking up and potentially priming a strain that can survive warmer bee hives. And yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'll start and say with the extracts, it's a big step in the right direction. I'm still not entirely sure how completely unique they are as opposed to these other plant extracts and so on that we could test and see. But what I think where it's really making the mark is getting beekeepers to think about bee nutrition in a larger context and just know that feeding them sugar water is not sufficient. The bees are surviving, but they're not healthy. And with these other problems that hives are encountering, they need something more than just sugar water. And so even if these beekeepers look at our final product and say, well, it's too expensive for us to use, hopefully the big thing is to kind of give them the kick to move past just sugar water and really try to feed the bees an actual bee feed rather than something that's cheap like corn syrup. I'd say the Medarisium, however, Varroa is such a problem. It is such a huge problem. And we're getting results on par with oxalic acid treatments and so on in a way that implies that it will be usable. It will make an impact. I think that one really has the potential to perhaps make a bigger impact because Varroa is a bigger problem. If you can control your mites, then you control your viruses downstream.
Right, it's indirectly because Varroa transmit so many viruses. So if you can keep the Varroa population down, you can control the vector and therefore hopefully control some of your viral loads.
Yeah, I would say that is fairly clear that if you really can control your mites, you keep the viruses levels down. Keeping the virus levels down, keeping the pathogens down with extracts and things like that will help. But Varroa is still a deadly menace.
It's one of those, if your hive is infected with Varroa and you don't do anything about it, it's just a matter of time before that colony dies. It's not a question of if they will, it's a question of when.
Yeah, we did an experiment where we set out 48 colonies that were as low as with Varroa as we could get.
They were treated.
They were treated heavily.
Yeah.
And then we put these out in a
new yard.
Yeah, a new yard is an urban location, but there's probably a backyard beekeeper somewhere nearby. Within the first year, every single hive had Varroa mites. And by the end of the next field season, we had to call that experiment off because I think it was 42 of the 46 were dead, or 42 of the 48. So mites will appear in the first year, and if you don't do anything, your colony will be dead in that second year, and it's just so deadly that the Medarisium has that opportunity to be a bit of a game changer, especially when the chemicals are failing simultaneously.
Yeah, and the other thing that I didn't mention about Medarisium is you've mentioned that the Met52 is widely in use as a mycopesticide already, and I believe the FDA has already deemed it safe for human contact and all of that, which is fantastic because most of the acaricides that beekeepers use is not safe for humans. Some of them are like class C carcinogens. And so you can't use them all year. You can't, especially when you're producing honey, it is a very big no-no to treat your hives. Whereas with Medarisium, since hopefully I haven't gone through all the paperwork yet, but since it's already been deemed safe by the FDA for human contact and whatnot, we're hopeful that this will be allowed to be applied during honey production, which is something that no other acaricides can be done right now.
Yeah, at least the vast majority of them.
Yeah, maybe some of them. I don't know.
I just say another thing we haven't touched on is that we've done a lot of work to select and change this strain so it's very deadly against Varroa mites. We could do similar things and begin to target it towards spider mites, for example, or some of these greenhouse pests. We now have a strain that's very tolerant to high temperatures, and that has been a limiting factor for pathogenic fungi for biocontrol for quite a while. Bovaria and Medarisium fungi are typically treated as cold weather applications because they do not handle the heat well. Hopefully now that we've developed this into this one strain, we could then move it into other cropping systems as well.
Mm-hmm. And luckily it's so adaptable. The Medarisium is is unbelievable. Same with Beauveria, and about, they make up over a third of the mycopesticides, just those two strains alone, or species. And yeah, I'm so optimistic for the future. We're at a time where it's vital for us to figure out these solutions to these world problems, or else, a lot of people say save the planet, but it's really save the humans. We're fucked. I think a lot of people paint Mother Earth as really fragile, but I mean, man, we've already gone through 6 major mass extinctions, and life has a way of coming back. I think it's just humans, whatever. We missed a gear or something. We just have really, we're really great at messing things up. But, we have the potential of really consciousness and awareness to see the mistakes and learn from them. And so now it's like, okay, we made all our mistakes, and let's look at them, let's see the truth, and let's fix it. And it might be that Medierisium isn't even the strain that we use, and that's fine. And it could be that, we don't even use mycelium, we use the actual mushrooms, or we use a different substrate, or we don't even use fungi, we use a plant, but whatever it is, we'll figure it out, or a specific extraction of how to extract the mycelium or the mushrooms or whatever we're using at a certain alcohol percentage. And that's the world of difference, or using oil instead of alcohol, or a powder instead. And these little tweaks, if we can just learn and adapt and find solutions that change the world and save humanity from the brink of extinction, because we're really at that brink. And so I applaud you. This is awesome. You said in the beginning, you were like, I was going to solve the cancer crisis. And I think this is equally as important, if not more. And this is a cancer to bees, and that, all systems are connected. So that is our pollinators, that we will run out of food, we will run out of our biodiversity. And so thank you two for doing this work. I applaud you in any way that we can be of service and help to you two, and anybody that you work with, please. And anybody else listening, we're all in this together, and it's up to us to make the difference.
No, I fully agree. Plant flowers, keep your areas as wild as you can. We prune our elderberry tree in a way that invites native bees to burrow into the stems and make little solitary bee homes right there in the yard. There's so many ways that you can make, just with your little spot, little things you can do to help out, the rewilding of America. All we have to do is stop messing it up and let things regrow.
Don't try to kill everything, please.
In Eastern Washington, we live close to some of these forests of Idaho that were absolutely clear cut. And, sometimes it takes 80 years, but life comes back, and it can be beautiful.
This is one of the reasons why we plant trees as a company, and we've planted over 33,000 trees. Next year, we're going to plant 10,000 more all over the globe. And it's important to shape our environment and promote biodiversity, because, like you said, you found Medarisium in your backyard, but there's other strains and other fungi that we will lose if we continue to clear cut. And there might be a solution, in the old growth forest or the Amazon rainforest or some other forest around the world. Some fungi that we haven't even found yet. We haven't even tapped the surface of how many species are out there. We barely even found the tiny ice crystal on top of the iceberg of how many species of mushrooms or fungi are out there. And one of them is going to save the bees, or one of them is going to save humanity, and one of them is going to become this amazing mycopesticide. One of them is, and so let's preserve our ecosystems, and let's be symbiotic with our ecosystems and find these solutions and continue to adapt, be open-minded, and do research. And if not everyone gets to be awesome researchers like you two, and so at the very least, just plant some wildflowers in your front yard. Don't make a barren lawn. I know so many people want that sterile looking lawn, but please plant some food and plant some wildflowers at the very least. Flowers are beautiful. Plant some more flowers. And you've inspired me, because we have a few flowers up front, but now I want to go out and buy some wildflowers and just make our whole front lawn wildflowers. And so thank you.
Yeah, much like the enjoyment of growing your own food and then eating it, when you do grow these flowers and you see, you're bringing in the bees, and then if you can set up a solitary bee house or start providing some habitat too, you can get that same sort of joy. It's really fun to go out there and see who's out pollinating that day.
I get a kick out of it. Every morning I take the dogs out and I look at the flowers and I watch all the butterflies and moths and bees and solitary bees and flies that come out. It's so much fun.
Thanks for stopping in and smelling the flowers. We need more of that.
Yeah.
Have y'all seen the documentary Honeyland?
No.
I think I did see that one a few years ago. Yeah.
It's a funky one. I feel like they barely have any talking, and it's this interesting soundtrack.
It's based in North Macedonia, and it's basically this hyper spotlight on this. There's like a population of 3 to 5 people in this super remote part of northern Macedonia, and they're beekeepers. And they have like 2 sources of food. It's honey and one other thing, and occasionally they'll go into town and trade jars of honey for food and other commodities that they'll need. But they are probably the most low maintenance people I've ever seen in a documentary, and it was just beautiful of how minimal of an effort you need to put to really have a symbiosis with the land around you. Yeah, it's a great documentary, and
it's also pulls on your heartstrings because they are struggling with colony collapse, and it's the main woman's only source of income is this honey, and so it's beautiful. I highly recommend seeing it. We just watched it a couple months ago on it was great. And I want to put it back to you guys. Are there any resources out there, documentaries, blogs, websites, XYZ, books that people can learn more about the work that you're doing, or just beekeeping in general?
Ooh. So, I mean, our lab has a website, although I can't promise how regularly it's updated, per se. Do you have any good honeybee resources that aren't like dense textbooks?
Right. The problem with honeybee resources right now is things are changing so fast. I have a copy of The Hive and the Honeybee over here, and it's from the 1980s. And its mention of Varroa is 0. It doesn't even mention it by name. It has a couple paragraphs on these Asian mites that might be a problem in some other places. So, things change quite quickly. And I know that The Hive and the Honeybee as a book has been updated by the company that makes it, but there's not a lot of great resources right now. There's several social media groups.
Right.
Yeah, social media groups like the Pollinator Partnership and so on, the Be Informed Partnership.
Yeah, APIS.
Yeah, Project APIS M. Several of them have good social media presences, and you can begin to get a good idea of not only the problems facing bees, but kind of the seasonal challenges that bees face. Because a lot of these groups also work with a big commercial industry, and every year a truck turns over, full of bees, and will shut down a highway. Or every year some poor beekeeper gets their forklift stuck in the mud, or all these little tribulations that come along with raising honeybees.
Mm-hmm.
Baby steps and perseverance.
Yeah, it would
Yeah.
be great if everybody could keep their bees near that mixed, wildflower meadow with a forest nearby, so they could forage on tree sap and the wood decay fungi and all of that. Most bees are not fortunate enough to have that situation, so we have to do what we can to help them out. Even if it is something that feels a little convoluted, like growing fungi in a lab, extracting it into this juice and feeding it in sugar water, it's still going to help them out.
Yeah.
Ideally, there would be a rotting log somewhere for them to forage on naturally, but
Yeah.
that's not happening.
We have one more question, and it's a question we ask all of our guests. So the question is, if fungi had the mic and could say one thing to the whole human race, what do you think they would say?
All right, so my answer to this is when you look at the fungal kingdom, there are some pathogens and so on, but many of them, one of their primary functions is decomposers. They break down, dead life back into the original components, so those original components can be turned back into new life. We as humans make a lot of things that we have no plan for their death. Plastic is an amazing substance, and we should not really, get bad on plastic. The problem is this plastic that's going to last for hundreds of years, we just toss it into the environment and nothing can break it down. As humans, we need to do better to engineer things that either life can break down and turn it back into those original components, or find some way that we do it ourselves. Because it's just like, making things that are semi-permanent and then just expecting life to take care of it is, it's an absurdity. And that's how we end up with so much plastic in the oceans and so on. We make these things to live thousands of years and
then just throw them away like it's
discard
nothing.
them away. And there's nothing to fill that fungal style of, break it back down and make it usable again. So just from an engineering standpoint, we need to do better with our materials, with how we interact with the environment, and make sure that things can be broken down. If not by life, then by us before it's over.
And I guess if I had anything to say, it would be, I think it would be, people are so focused on the mushrooms. I love mushrooms. Like, I love foraging. I love the edibles. Like, we just got back with, I can't even tell you how many pounds of chanterelles and matsutake that we found. I love them. However, there's so much more to the fungal kingdom than edibles. And there's so much that you can learn from fungi. Like, again, Medarisium, it's a soil fungus. It looks like a mold. It's not very sexy. But there's so much, it's so neat, right? There's so much diversity out there that is yet to be discovered or really understood. And so I guess I speak for all the fungi out there that no one ever thinks about. There's so many cool things that you just have to look.
Yes, when we would go hiking with Lori Karras, recently retired mycologist, been around for decades, and we'd be out in the forest and I say, "What's that?" And she's, "No idea. Nobody knows. Nobody's ever documented it. Like, there's just such an nobody's even tried. There's just not enough people looking at, especially the rare species. We barely have a handle on the common species that we eat, which is absurd." We need to do better with the biodiversity aspect and respect the role that the wood decayers and all these others do. When we go into these logged forests, when these forests are raised for continuous logging, there's not a lot of deadfall. The wood's taken away, and that means there's not a lot of wood decay fungi. There's not as much leaf litter. And so all the ecosystem that gets supported, all those wood boring beetles, the wood decay beetles, there's so many, so much life just under the surface. And, if we kind of need to let some of the dead go and let that part of the ecosystem come back.
Thanks for doing your part.
And that's an invitation for everyone tuning in. Get out there and do some cool shit. Stop to smell the flowers, plant more flowers, and do some cool shit. And we want to thank everyone for tuning in, shrooming in with us for another episode of Mushroom Revival Podcast. Wherever you're tuning in from, either listening, watching, or both, thank you. We love you. Sending a big fungal hug your way. And Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Tell your friends all about mushrooms and bees and anything else that you learned and how cool they are and how we have to save humanity and the world. And please, leave a review, whatever is genuine to you, 1 star, 5 star, and head over to our website at mushroomrevival.com. We have a whole line of mushroom extracts. And please reach out to us if you have a future topic that you want us to dive into or a guest that you want us to bring on a show. We would love to hear from you, even if it's just to say hi, because we're super friendly, love to talk about mushrooms. Just to say hi, we're always here. So thank you, everyone. Much love, and may the spores be with you.